Record.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So, Shiur Tov, everyone. Good morning. Maybe I'll just start off with a brief summary of what we discussed last time, and then I'll try and take it, clarify anything that's unclear, and then take it to, I hope, a conclusion of the sugya. We basically saw a series of tosuses, really based on the Gemara, many Gemaras, which indicated that ein imor elo b'makom gedolei karka. The imor, this was principle number one. The imor is only applicable in the makom gedolei karka, and this is based upon the language of our Gemara. Haiman the konef milcha memilchasa. So Tosus is medayik. Why did it say only if you harvest salt from the salt beds? The answer is because ein imor elo b'gedolei karka. This was principle number one. We also saw principle number two, which is really Rava and Abaya, but perhaps everyone would agree that ein imor elo b'gedolei karka. Now, this idea that ein imor elo b'makom gedolei is definitely the view of Tosfos. However, it might not be the view of the Rambam. And there are two ways to learn the Rambam. Well, three ways to learn the Rambam. Either the Rambam agrees with Tosfos, and every time the Rambam talks about imor, he means only b'makom gedolei, even though he doesn't specify that, and one would have wanted him to say it clearly. Alternative number two in the Rambam is that the Rambam completely disagrees with this concept of ein imor elo b'gedolei karka, and there seems to be a lot of evidence for that. And alternative number three is some form of compromise position. Why do I say there's some evidence for the Rambam that he doesn't agree with this rule of ein imor elo b'gedolei karka? And here I'm looking at the sheets that I gave out, and there's really two Rambams. There's the Rambam in Perek Ches Halacha Vav, who says I'm a kabitz deveil of osim menu igul. If you squash together figs and make them into an igul, they used to make like a circle of these fruit, or you string them up. This is a tolda of ma'amer and yochayev. On that, Ramosha Cohn of Meluniel says he has to mean when you do this in the place where they fell, because surely ein imor elo b'gedolei karka. However, the Rambam doesn't say that. Okay, but maybe that's what the Rambam meant. However, we then turn to the Rambam in Perek Kaf Aleph, Halacha Yud Aleph, in which the Rambam is paskening a difficult Gemara in Shabbos, and the Gemara in Shabbos Kufmen Gimel Amud Bey says that if this pasrulei peres b'chotzer, peres became scattered in the courtyard, melachot yad al yad. You can pick them up one by one and eat them. However, you can't put them into a basket in case you do, in case you do as one does during the weekday. So Tosfos learns this to mean that there's no issue with ma'amer over here because it's not makom gedolei, and the whole issue is uvda d'chol, and perhaps there's other problems going over here that they get mixed up with dirt, and therefore there's issues of boa and other such things. But ma'amer there isn't because it's not makom gedolei. The Rambam, however, seems to say clearly not like that. The Rambam in Perek Kaf Aleph Halacha Yud Aleph quotes this Gemara, and the Rambam says, if you stick peres together to become one guf, you're chayev. Therefore, he says, if fruit scattered in the courtyard, you can gather them one by one and eat them, but you shouldn't put them into a basket. Why shouldn't you put them into the basket? Because maybe it's a gezerah, perhaps that will lead to pressing them together, to being yich b'shem yada, that you'll press them with your hands, and that will be imor, which you are chayev for. So here the Rambam seems to be saying explicitly that there is imor that you are chayev for in your chotzer, and it would appear that a chotzer is not the makom gidol, a courtyard. Why are we talking about a courtyard? Why did it say peres shenis pasru the chotzer, peres that became scattered in a courtyard? Seemingly it's talking about a second, it was already harvested and brought in, and now it's in your courtyard and it becomes scattered. So how do we read that Rambam? Sorry, Gary.
wouldn't it be intuitive that there are some kinds of imor you do out in the field, and there are some kinds of imor that after you've gathered in the field, you take it back into your home, and you would string together your figs, or do things that you wouldn't normally do out in the field, and therefore that one of them would have the concept of only in the place of Gidulah, and the other one not, just in the place of Gidulah.
Yes. So you're absolutely correct, and there's two ways of reading the Rambam. Either the Rambam rejects this whole idea of ein imor ela b'makom gidol, and therefore the Rambam is saying there's imor even not b'makom gidol. Or alternatively, the Rambam is saying your point, that when it comes to the imor of pressing or stringing fruit together, which is not imor but the tolda of imor, that applies even in the chotzer, whereas classic imor, sheaving, applies only b'makom gidol. What would be the logic of that? So there's two svaras one could say. And I mentioned this from the Nishmas Odom, the halachic work of Rabbi Zobin, who's more famous with Chaya Odom. And he learns this very pashat in the Rambam, as does a sefer called the Meiser Keach, both of which are brought in the Mishnah Berurah, which we'll see shortly. And both of them understand that the Rambam agrees that ein imor ela b'makom gidol when it comes to sheaves, but doesn't think that ein imor ela b'makom gidol when it comes to stringing fruit together. What's the difference? One of two theories. The Meiser Keach seems to say exactly like Harry. There's not a rule, a Halacha Moshe Sinai, that imor doesn't apply, or imor only applies in the place where it grew. It's a logic. It's a stage in the production process, and therefore the malacha makes sense in that stage of the production process, which is normally done in the field. That's the derech in the language that we saw. It's the derech of imor. However, there is imor where the derech is to do it even shelo b'makom gidol, such as stringing fruit together, and that would apply in the chotzer. That's one way of understanding it. A second way of understanding it, which I suggest is how the Nishmas of Ram understands it, is that imor has to be a constructive achievement. Something has to happen. In the manufacturing process, there's something that happens, is it's prepared for the next stage in the 11-stage process of transferring grain into bread. Adam and Josh pointed out that the language of the Tosafot says that there's even a name given to this. It ceases to be stalks, and instead it becomes a bundle, an omer. However, the malacha itself, the achievement, is different to the achievement of other malachas. There isn't a physical change in the object. It doesn't go from being raw food to being cooked food. The change is it's now in a more useful and usable form as part of the manufacturing process. And therefore, once it's already come in for the makom gidol, this malacha wouldn't make sense, because gathering it together in the house is not the malacha of imor. However, if you do make it into something new, with a new functionality, such as strung together fruit or pressed together fruit, there the Rambam would agree that makes sense in the house. Now, both these reasons, I think, tie into the same broad concept that imor is a malacha because it's part of the manufacturing process, not because of an obvious achievement, a physical achievement in and of in itself. We saw this language of derech imor already coming from the Rif, and the Rif also uses language of derech, and it would seem to make sense in the context of manufacturing process of imor, because imor is in a sense a weaker malacha than other malachas. It's not literally a change in the functionality from the point of view of the object, it's a change in the functionality from the point of view of my plans as a human manufacturer. Therefore, there would be this distinction between imor in the soda and imor in the field. So Gary, I think your point is absolutely right, that it's only something done in the field, but the reason that has an impact on the malacha is because imor is a manufacturing malacha, not a malacha that's to do with a fundamental change in the status of the object. So to summarize, we have three positions that we can take in terms of imor b'makom gedoloi. Tosfos, he says, ein imor ela b'makom gedoloi. Position number two, which perhaps or perhaps not is the view of the Rambam, that there is imor even shelo b'makom gedoloi. And position number three, which perhaps or perhaps not is the view of the Rambam, that depends which sort of imor we are talking about. So that was the second sort of discussion that we had in the last year. The third thing that we discussed was the view of the Tosfos Rid, which I'm not going to go into again now for the moment, which is that ein ma'amer acha ma'amer, that once you've done ma'amer, you can't do another ma'amer. And I think this is again based upon a similar sort of lomdus. It's a parallel term to, for example, ein bishul acha bishul. However, with bishul, it makes sense. Once something is cooked, it's cooked, and therefore you can't cook it again. You've made the change already. With imor, it's a little more difficult. I mean, if it became scattered, sorry, if it became scattered, why can't I do the imur again? And by the way, there is an example of this in Bishul. In Bishul also, if something was raw and then was cooked and then the cooking was undone, then you could do a cooking again to it. It's not a rule that you can't cook something twice. It's just in general, once it's cooked, it's no longer raw, and therefore the melachot doesn't make sense. So with imur, why should you not be able to do the melachot again if it became scattered again? And seemingly the answer is the same sort of logic, that imur is a melachot in the manufacturing process, and therefore doesn't make sense in this context. So that's, I think, what we saw last time. And I hope, Adam, I think that should answer the question that you wrote to me off group via WhatsApp. Okay. Any questions before we go further?
So presumably, if the second imur was an improvement on the first imur, that would still be able to say that there is imur after imur?
Yes, I think that would be true, and perhaps this is what the Rambam is saying, and thank you for reminding me this. Perhaps this is what the Rambam is saying also when he says that you can string it together. You've already done imur stage 1, but you haven't done imur stage 2. Okay. So I'm just writing notes to myself. Okay. The next thing I want to do is take these principles and just see how they're applied to practical halacha. I gave you the Mishnah Berurah sheets, but perhaps we won't run through them in order. I'll just try and bring out pertinent on the sheets I printed, the Maramikoma sheets I printed. I did print the Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan, but perhaps we'll just go out of order and just try and run through some of the practical halachas. The first thing is, actually, I'll start off with Gary's point, even though I was going to come to it later. It would appear that yesh imur, acha imur, if you are improving the level of imur. So there is an eglei tal. I've mentioned the eglei tal before. The eglei tal is known as is also the author of the Avnei Nezer. He was a Ram of Sochachov, a very important Hasidic Rebbe, and also the author of a massively influential halachic work on Hilchos Shabbos, and he says that there would imur acha imur would make sense if you up the imur level a notch. And the example he gives, I'm not enough of a farmer to completely understand this, but he says if you gather stalks into a bundle, that bundle is called an omer, and then if you gather that bundle together and make a godish, I always thought godish is some sort of haystack, but hay is made of straw. He says you make it into another sort of larger bundle, then the idea of imur acha imur would apply because you've upped it a notch and made it into a deeper gathering. So that would be the idea of imur acha imur. Point number 2 is, what does this isuf need to be? To what degree does it need to be gathered together? Is it enough that I just hold it together in my hands, or do I need something more than that? It remains a little unclear in halacha. Seemingly, the melachot should only apply if I change the object and I'm kosher it or stick it together. But nonetheless, the poskim don't understand it that way, and they seem to understand even if I hold it in my hands, this would be enough. This would be enough to be the malacha. According to some poskim, other poskim disagree. Now there would be 2 reasons why one would question whether it makes sense to merely hold it in the hand. The first thing is, what exactly have I changed in the object? And the second thing is that malachas normally need to be permanent, and in this case, it's merely a temporary malacha. Nonetheless, the counter argument to this would be that I'm still chayav for this malacha because imur is different to other malachas. It's part of the production process of moving it on to the next stage, and this is therefore the permanence of the malacha, that I have it gathered together in order to make it into, then bring it into the house or the barn and begin doing the threshing process and the winning process and the other things that I need to do. So this is a second point. A third thing that remains unclear is what is the shear of imur. Now, all melachos have a measure or a minimum quantity, and the Rambam tells us very clearly that the minimum quantity of imur depends why I'm gathering it in. If I'm gathering it in order to make food out of it, then the shear would be a grogeres, like is the normal shear for all eating food manufacture melachos. If I'm gathering it to do firewood, then it's the amount of firewood that I can cook an egg, and so on and so forth. However, what the Rambam doesn't say is how many pieces, how many articles do I need to gather together for it to be the melacha? Is it enough if I gather together 2 pieces, or do I need to have more pieces to make it an omer? And again, this question it makes sense in the context of meleches imur. At what point is it a significant achievement of gathering things together to make it useful? Is it enough that I gather 2 things together, or even that I need to gather more? The Aruch HaShulchan says even 2 things gathered together is more, but again, I couldn't find extensive discussion of this in the poskim. They seem to assume that even gathering 2 things together is enough to be chayiv in the melacha of imur. Now, what's with respect to ein imur ela b'makom geduloi, and what's with respect to the machlokas Rava and Abaya about imur with gedulei karka? So here I want us to turn to the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah on page 4 in the handout sheets. And the Shulchan Aruch says, Osur lekabitz melech masreifas hamelech. You're not allowed to gather salt from the salt pools, shedoy melem ma'ameh, because it's similar to ma'ameh. What does the Shulchan Aruch mean? Clearly the Shulchan Aruch is posting that this is not actual ma'ameh. This is merely doy melem ma'ameh. It's merely similar to ma'ameh. And it's osa, meaning to say that the Shulchan Aruch is pasking like Abaya against Rava stroke Rabba, and he's pasking that you are not chayav for ma'ameh with the salt from the salt basins. Why are you not chayav? Evidently because it's not gedulei karka. Nonetheless, it's osa. So this is Mara Makom number 1, that Abaya holds there's no chiyuv since it's not Makom gedulei karka. Since it's not gedulei karka. Nonetheless, it's osa midrabanon. And this is explicit in the Mishnah Berurah Sif Kotten Lamed Vav that I printed in the handout. In Sif Kotten Lamed Zayin, the Mishnah Berurah struggles with the lack of clarity of the language of the Shulchan Aruch, because he says, it's called Mokum Gedulei. You're not allowed to gather anything from its Mokum Gedulei, but he also calls that Osa as opposed to Chayiv, and he says that the Shulchan Aruch has to mean Chayiv, not Osa. So why does he use the language of Osa? The Shulchan Aruch says it's Osa to gather anything b'mokum geduloi rather than chayav. The answer is because the Shulchan Aruch wants to indicate that if it's not mokum geduloi, then it's mutter. So here we have a source, the Mishnah Berurah Sif Kotten Lamed Zayin, who learns that the logic of the lomdus of mokum geduloi only is enough to not just make you potter of an Osa, but even make you mutter. And therefore the Mishnah Berurah is effectively paskening like Tosfos, who says that b'makom geduloi, that there's a rule of b'makom geduloi with ma'ameh. In the next Sif and Shulchan Aruch which I printed, Sif Yud, the Mishnah Berurah says the Shulchan Aruch says a makabitz deveil of asam menu igul. Here he brings the Rambam that if you make an igul, you are chayiv. And the Mishnah Berurah says because it's the derech to be mechaber them in that way, and therefore this is a tolda. And then he brings from the Nishmas Adam and the Meiser Rekeach, both of whom I mentioned, who say that even if you do so in the house, you're chayav. And the way he phrases it is, he says, because in this manner, also yilasos gamabayis. It's normal to also do in the house. So this sounds very much like Gary's svara, that there isn't a rule that there's no imor in the house. There's a rationale and logic, which is that it's not the derech to do imor outside in the house, but with something where it is the derech, such as fruit, which you make into the devela, that would be the melacha. But again, that would only be where you make them into a devela, not where you put them into a fruit bowl. Surely it's the melacha to gather fruit into a fruit bowl into the house also. The answer to the question is that that's gathering into a fruit bowl. That's not part of the manufacturing process of moving on for the next stage. It's not adding utility. It's simply preparing it for eating, and therefore this isn't enough for the melacha of ma'ameh. So this is how this translates into practical halacha. There's another principle over here which the Aruch HaShulchan brings in source 13. He says, Poshet hu, Delo shaykh ma'ameh elo b'tzvua or peris shelo nefer v'lo nisbashlu. I have to tell you, this is a Aruch HaShulchan I struggled with a little bit. The Aruch HaShulchan says that Imur only applies to artifacts which have not been food items, which have not been baked or cooked or ground, and therefore they're niksorim or nikloshim. They're still in their post-harvest state. But he says if that wasn't the case, you wouldn't be able to put loaves of bread or fruit next to each other, because this would be meleches ma'ameh. And therefore he says the malacha is only when you're gathering them in from the field or from the gardens or from the trees, and not when they're in the house. So Aruch HaShulchan here seems to be merging two separate halachas together, or even three separate halachas together. And the first point he says is that if you've processed it, then it's no longer gathering it in from the field, and therefore you are potter. And the second point, and then he links that to the idea that you're only chayav in the field, not in the house. So I think here the Aruch HaShulchan, so how does the Aruch HaShulchan link these two halachas? I mean, what's the connection between the two? When he says if you cook or bake the food, does he simply mean because that takes place in the house? In which case he's not adding a new halacha that manufactured food doesn't have the melachot of imur. He's simply just saying the same thing, that you're not chayav an imur when it's in the house, only when it's in the field. So I think what he's saying is that this applies even if you bake it out in the field. And the logic he's saying is that something can move away from the field geographically or conceptually. If you bring it into the house, the reason why you're potter is because it's no longer a harvested object. It's food that's sitting inside your house. And therefore, imur doesn't make sense because imur is part of the manufacturing process of food. Therefore, similarly, if you make it into bread out in the field, it's moved from being in the field. It may geographically still be located in the field, but conceptually, it's food. It's no longer harvested food. And I remind you of our previous discussion, in which we said that at some point between melacha number 1, which is choresh or zereah, which is certainly in the ground, and melacha number 11, which is baking and producing the end product of food, the melacha moves away from being a field melacha to being a food melacha. The Aruch HaShulchan is arguing that ma'ameh is not a food melacha, it's a field melacha, and therefore if either it's geographically moves away from the field because it's now in the house, or conceptually it's moved away from the field because it's now manufactured, it therefore ceases to be a malacha in a dover haniklash v'nikta. I think these are very important words. It says and therefore your potter, you're not chayav on the malacha. I also think, therefore, this is what led me to away from understanding that the lomdos of the Rambam that says that if you put it into a devela, your chayiv is just because this is the derech to do it in the house, and understood that to mean that it's saying that with develas the manufacturing process isn't complete, and it even carries on if you string it together or press them together in the house. That's also part of the manufacturing process. So what this is telling us is how careful we have to be in Hilchos Shabbos. Even though the poskim say rules, which we can apply sort of blindly and unthinkingly, we'll make a terrible mistake in Hilchos Shabbos. There isn't a rule, a mathematical rule, ein imur elo b'makom gedoloi. There's a logic, which is when it ceases to be the manufacturing process, you're potter. You can achieve that even out in the field by baking and cooking it there. And it could be with some fruits, even inside the house, it's part of the manufacturing process, because this is how you manufacture it by making it into a devela, even out in the even inside the house. That's still a step in the manufacturing process. This is really the point I'm trying to bring out, that even though the Rishonim speak about this as if this is a principle, this isn't magic over here. There isn't some tradition they had as Halacha Moshe Sinai that imur only applies in the field, not in the house. They were using reason to understand what the nature of the melacha is, and therefore it's possible that you can dream up scenarios where even inside the house there would be imur if that's part of the manufacturing process, and similarly there can be scenarios where even outside the house there's no imur because you've already started the next stage of manufacturing, the food processing part of it, the tchina and the bishul, out in the field. Any thoughts or questions?
Isn't the manufacturing process, the whole point of it is to eat the product? So when you said before that he brought it into the house and gathered it in a bowl, but that was only in order to eat it, well, it's kind of continuing the manufacturing process, because isn't that the point of it in a way? Yeah,
it appears to me that that's not the manufacturing process. That's simply getting it ready for your own eating. It's not preparing it for another stage in processing, and that's the chiluk over here.
What about for things like boreh, where we've said previously that it might apply to socks in a drawer or something like that? Where that seems like a scenario which is very removed from a manufacturing process.
Correct, and that's the point, because boreh is a melacha in a product, and therefore we can extend it from. No one says that boreh only applies to gedolei karka. Why not? Because boreh has made the transition from being a melacha in a field to being a melacha in food. Once it's a melacha in food, there's no logic to say only food, but any item of utility to human beings, as opposed to ma'amer, which would appear to be the last of the field melachas. And this is what we said, there's a transition that takes place.
Yeah, but it's still part of that manufacturing process between wheat and bread.
That is correct, but it is a processing of adding utility to a product as opposed to a completion of a harvesting. Harvesting is something that only makes sense b'makom gedolei with gedolei karka. Processing of food is something that takes place in the kitchen, has nothing to do with makom gedolei and gedolei karka. Boreh takes place in the barn. Which one is it? Is it a harvesting melacha or a food manufacture melacha? We see it's a food melacha, and therefore there's no logic that it should apply to only food, not to any other items of utility. I'm trying to argue that there's a legion, a wealth of halachas, all of which are built around the same conceptual thought, which is this a harvesting melacha, or is this a product melacha? If it's a product melacha, then it doesn't make sense to talk about it only b'makom gidol. It doesn't make sense to say only gedolei karka, and so on and so forth. And therefore we can extend it to boreh, which takes place with grains and things, to socks. However, if it's a field melacha, that's where Chazal understood the limitations make sense. It's that we only see this melacha in gedolei karka, we can't extend it. And therefore the discussions that we see in the Gemara, at which point the law of ein gedolei karka clicks in or not, is reflecting a deeper issue, which is what's the nature of the melacha. Zerei and choresh are easy. These are melachas in the field. These aren't melachas. If you ask a farmer, what are you doing? And he says, I'm producing the food. That's not. He's not a London. He's working on the field. When you're baking in the kitchen, you're producing food. At some point in the process, it switches between the two. And I would argue that the switch occurs straight after Imur. That's when this switch occurs, when it ceases to be a field malacha and becomes a product malacha.
So I think I understand what you're saying. My question is just why is it that we would say with the over here, in our case of Ma'amer, we're saying that it would, we are going to go, well, this is only a manufacturing thing, and therefore it would only apply to this set of items. Where then we move over to the ochel, and we say, well, this is now moved into a buy it context, and it's ochel, and therefore I might apply it out to other things. But why don't I say, well, this would only apply to ochel in the same way that ma'amer would only apply to things within manufacturing?
Yeah. I can only half answer your question, which is there's a tipping point. It's a spectrum. And at some point on the tipping point, it swings from one to the other. It becomes more choshev as the item and less about the product. I have to say intuitively, I understand why ma'amer is a good stopping point, but I can't prove it to you. In one of the things I've tried to show, both in this sugya and in every sugya we've learned, that all Lomdus works in this way. That you can look at things in different lenses, and there comes a tipping point of reasonableness of when to look at. Arguably, again, if this is a machlokas Rava and Abaya, and Rava, again, we don't know how to read Rava. Is it that Rava thinks that salt is also gedolei karka, or is it that he holds you don't need gedolei karka for ma'amer? If he holds you don't need gedolei karka for ma'amer, then Rava's feeling is, or intuition is, that the switch happens at a different stage to where Abaya thinks the switch happens. I just want to remind you of another example of this from those who were with us on a much longer journey that started in Masechet Brachos. Those of you who weren't with us in Brachos, I'll explain this to you. And it's just another example of the same sort of conceptual thinking. There are brachas which you make on the food product, the biological entity of the food. Bori pri Adam or Bori pri ha'etz is a bracha on the material. Hamotzi lechem min ha'aretz is a bracha on the product. It's a type of food. So sometimes we make brachas on types of food where they're defined by the functionality. It's bread, not cake, not water. And other times we make the bracha based upon the biological entity. Carrots and apples aren't a different sort of functionality. They're different sorts of biological entity. The chiddush of bread is that it ceases to be vegetable pie. Bread is just vegetable pie. That's all that bread is. Bread is mashed vegetables. Normally, when there's a vegetable that you often mash, you make hardama on it. The chiddush of bread is it becomes subsumed. The chashivas, the importance of bread, is so significant that it gets a new functionality associated with it. And now it's bread, and it ceases merely to be a vegetable. And when that transition occurs and how is an interesting subject. What happens if you just make grain stew? If you make carrot stew, it's just carrots. If you make grain stew, like a cholent, barley stew or something like that, is that barley's or is it a new functionality, a new sort of dish? Masechet Shabbat, that was the sugya there. Boru piagofen, wine, is that a bracha on a biological entity, product of grapes, or is it a bracha on yayin, which has its own functionality on a product? So the whole Torah is full of this transition. When do we consider something by its functionality? When do we consider something by its raw material? And Imor is the meeting point, which is why I keep on going on about it over here. It's the border between these two worlds, and it possibly, excitingly, a machlokas Rav Abaye, which side of the border Imor falls. We've run out of time, and I just want to finish off with. I'll say literally one more point, very, very brief point, and then I'll stop, which is there is a question over here on this idea that manufactured things don't have imur, which is what about the idea of b'mokum gedulei? How do these two halachas go together? And it's possible that a manufactured object, you could view its mokum gidul. I just found this interesting because the post can mention this. You could view the mokum gidul of a manufactured object as the factory where it was made, or the place where it was produced and it came into existence. So threads which are strung together into a beged, a garment, that might be their mokum gidul, because it got a new shame, a new status in halacha. It's no longer threads, it's now a beged, and the place where it got the beged might be its mokum gidul. I mentioned that simply as an abstract idea. In halacha l'maaseh we paskin that ein imor elo b'gedulei karka. However, the plate, how do these two halachas go together? Is it conceivable to hold that imor is only b'mokum gedulei karka, b'mokum gedulei, and yet imor doesn't apply gedulei karka? The post can say yes, because maybe you could hold that a manufactured item which is not gedulei karka, nonetheless is called mokum gedulei because of where it's manufactured. So we'll stop there. And that brings us to a conclusion of the sugya of Imur. Conclusion, we never conclude the sugya, but a conclusion of what we're going to learn on Imur. And I'll send via WhatsApp group the next sugya. For those who join this chaburah later, I will tell you that we've already done Boireh. So we're going to do the next set of melachos, which follow on from the Gemara, which is Dosh, after which we'll jump to probably a daf ahead where we'll look at the continuation of melachos, because we're going to be missing out Boireh. For those who weren't with us, I'm happy to share the Boireh recordings with you, and I wish you all a good day. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course.